Get started. So tonight we get to talk about the dividing of the kingdom. And let me turn this around a little bit. On the board, you will see a very crudely drawn map of the divided kingdom. The area that was ruled by David and Solomon was all of this area, plus Solomon over here into the regions of Arabia and down here toward the floor, actually, toward Egypt and so forth. Solomon dominated a tremendous area. Well, let me leave this like this for a moment. When the kingdom divided after Solomon died, you have Judah, the southern kingdom, which is one basic tribe, encompasses Jerusalem down into the Negev, which is this desert area to the south. From the Red Sea over here all the way to the Mediterranean coast, but along the coast you have the Philistines, primarily a Phoenician, not exactly seafaring, but fishing oriented and trade oriented people. When the nation divides, they divide pretty much along territorial boundaries. So right here, this little dotted blue line is basically would have been the dividing line between Judah's territory and Ephraim's territory to the north. Basically everything to the north, all of this to the east, on the east side of Jordan, the Transjordanic area, all the way up to Dan, is the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom under the idolatrous rulership of Jeroboam. Now, the territory of Tyre, where Hiram, the king of Tyre, was located, is over here, just a little swatch here. And the city of Tyre actually was built on an island just off the coast. When it was destroyed by building a causeway out to the island and then demolishing the fortress there. Mount Carmel, where Elijah will meet with the prophets of Baal and Asherah in the days of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, is right here just below this thumb that sticks out into the Mediterranean Sea, the Mediterranean Ocean. Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, is actually just about 20 or so miles north of Jerusalem. It's not far away. It's orders of magnitude away philosophically.
You said Samaria is the capital of the northern?
Yes, ma'am. Samaria becomes the capital of the northern kingdom. So, as we look at all these things, keep in mind that the sum total of the territory we're talking about, and I think I used this analogy last week, it's an area that's basically about the same size as from Atlanta north to Chattanooga, and from Atlanta west over to the Alabama state line. So it's less than 200 miles from top to bottom and maybe 50 miles wide at its widest point. We're not talking about a huge geographic area. They could walk from one end to the other in a matter of a few days. Well, we had ended up last time talking about the foolishness of Solomon and the death of Solomon. Talked about the wealth that he amassed, very possibly the only trillionaire in history, made Donald Trump look like a piker as far as being rich. Even Bill Gates and some of those guys couldn't match him, most likely. And one of the things that we had talked about last time was that Solomon was a marrying man. And he had wives and wives and wives, and he must have had a secretary just to help him keep track of which one he was talking to at any given time. But his foreign wives were his downfall. Now, when we talk about Solomon, one of the things that we need to keep in mind, he reigns for 40 years, 4 decades, starts as a comparatively young man, maybe 20-ish or thereabouts, and dies, by our standards, a comparatively young man in his early 60s, perhaps. Well, over the course of those 40 years, He writes 3,000 proverbs, 1,005 songs. He is a prolific writer. We have some of what he wrote in the books of Proverbs, a couple of the Psalms, in the book of Ecclesiastes, which is 12 chapters of Solomon's search for the meaning of life, is trying to understand what is my purpose in the world. And then we have the Canticles, or the Song of Songs, or most English translations call it the Song of Solomon. My father-in-law, my late father-in-law, was very much a product of his generation, and he did not like to study the book of Song of Solomon, and he did not like, he was not entirely convinced that it even belonged in the Bible. And there were some Jewish rabbis and scholars in the intertestamental period between captivity and the time of Christ who would have agreed with him. They didn't think that it was inspired because of its subject matter. And Song of Solomon is about married love. Song of Solomon is about sex. Well, if anybody knew anything about that, I expect Solomon did. Not to put too fine a point on it, but where in the 40 years of Solomon's life did he write these various writings? Ecclesiastes, the search for the meaning of life, would seem to come in the first half of his reign, in the first 20 or 25 years of his rulership. Because what's he doing for the first half of his rulership? He's building the kingdom. He is capitalizing on what David had left him. He's building the temple. He's building his own palace. Took 13 years just to do that. And he's very focused on consolidating and being God's man in many, many ways. You read the prayer of dedication at the dedication of the temple. That takes place, it took 7 years to build. That takes place somewhere between 10 and 15 years after Solomon actually became king. And you read that prayer of dedication in 2 Chronicles chapter 8, chapters 7 and 8. He's very focused on spiritual things at that point in his reign. And Ecclesiastes would fit very logically into that time frame, because Ecclesiastes is all about what is my purpose? What is the meaning of life? And Solomon, the key words, the average person reading Ecclesiastes is liable to think that the key words to Ecclesiastes are vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And that's not what the book is all about. The key words to the book of Ecclesiastes are the words life under the sun. Life in this world, in other words. What is the purpose? What is the meaning of life in this world? Why am I here? What am I supposed to do? And that's what Ecclesiastes is all about. Solomon's search for purpose, for meaning, for understanding. Get down to the very end, chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. And how does Solomon summarize all of his investigation? Now, in the course of Ecclesiastes, he talks about looking for purpose, for meaning in wealth. He talks about looking for purpose, for meaning in political power and conquest and influence. He talks about looking for purpose and meaning in relationships, in women, and so forth. He talks about looking for purpose and meaning in building things. And he built cities and big buildings and all kinds of things. Come down to the last two verses. And Solomon's summary, inspired by the Holy Spirit, is this. This is the end of the matter. Or in other words, here's the summary of my investigation. All hath been heard. I've looked in all of these different things. Wine, women, song, power, money, all this kind of stuff. This is the end of the matter. All hath been heard. Fear God, reverence God, and keep his commandments. For this, fearing God and keeping his commandments, this is the whole, and the King James Version supplies the word duty. It's not actually in the Hebrew text. This is the whole of man. That's the summary of what it is to be what God created. to be a man, to be a person in this world. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole of man, because, verse 14, for God shall bring every work into judgment, and every secret thing, whether it's good or evil. In other words, judgment's coming. So the basic lesson, be God's person, be God's man, be God's woman, so that you can face judgment with confidence. It would make perfect sense that that book would have been written at least in the first half of Solomon's reign. Probably the Proverbs would fall into the same time frame. Probably Song of Solomon would fall in that same general time period. And I say that simply because as we go on with Solomon, what do we find? For all of his wealth, his power, his wisdom, his good works, what's happening to him as time goes by? He's falling into idolatry. That's right. He begins to get away from God. Like Saul before David, Solomon begins to believe his own press. He begins to rely on his own wisdom. Now, Solomon is the wisest human being in all of history except for Jesus himself. And his wisdom is endowed by heaven. God gave him extraordinary wisdom. But with that wisdom, God did not take away his susceptibility to temptation and his ability to make bad choices. By the time we get to the end of Solomon's life, what do we find is going on in his kingdom? Well, not only has he married all these foreign women and allowed them to import their idolatry and in fact engaged in their idolatry with them himself, but what else has he done? As far as the nation of Israel is concerned, he has fulfilled everything that Samuel warned them about 120 years before, 115 years before. Drafting their sons and daughters and putting them to work and so forth. Taxing them until it was unbearably heavy. All of the things that they didn't want in a king, they've gotten with him. And he's not leaning on godly wisdom. He's not even apparently reading the things that he himself had written by inspiration. He's leaning on his own wisdom. What did Solomon write in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6? Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will direct your steps. But what's Solomon doing? Solomon is leaning on his own wisdom and trying to order his own way in the world. Did Solomon repent before he died? There's nothing in the scriptures that says he did. We look at all that he wrote and we look at the magnificence of his kingdom. By the way, by the time we get to the end of Solomon's reign, not only are the people restless and unhappy because of taxation and labor drafts and so forth, they're also unhappy because God is allowing foreign nations, enemies, to rise up and be a problem for him because of his unfaithfulness. Did Solomon? Yes, ma'am. Mary.
In answer to your question about did he repent, thinking about Hebrews 11, he's not mentioned in that chapter.
You're right.
But the beginning of chapter 12 says, seeing as how we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us put aside every weight and the sin that doth easily beset us.
Right.
And it seems to me as Solomon, and this is essentially, it seems to me, the battle that everyone fights. At the beginning, there was not much distance separating Solomon and God.
You're right.
I imagine because as he said, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. He probably had a healthy fear of God at that time when he was a young man and first taken. But he let those weights and sins, he put more and more of those between himself and God. And when you asked that question, I thought, did he get to the point where he couldn't even see his way back?
May have.
We don't know.
You're right. We don't know.
We don't know. That's the thing. We can only go with
He might
what God
have.
has revealed. I mean, it's the same thing with, I wondered about Samson. You know, when Samson died with the Philistines.
Yes, and brought down the house quite literally.
Yeah. And I mean, I just wondered about him as well.
Well,
You know, but the Bible doesn't say.
the one distinction
Is it Samson?
and Solomon is that when Samson pulls down the temple on top of himself, you know, we look at that and say, well, he committed suicide. And I don't believe he did. That his death was incidental to what he was trying to do, because what was he trying to do? He was trying to
Destroy the Philistines
in his death than he did in his life. And he succeeded in that. But leading up to that, what did he do at that point? He prayed, Lord, just give me strength one more time. And God granted that prayer. So did Samson turn back to the Lord? Evidently so. Did Solomon?
Well, Samson's mentioned in Hebrews 11.
Yes, Samson is there in the Hall of Fame of the faithful. Solomon is not. I would like to think that Solomon came to his senses.
I would think it would be in the Bible.
But there's nothing in the Bible that says he did, and everything I read sort of mitigates against that from what I'm seeing from my perspective. So I'm thinking, you know, if he did, the scriptures are 100% silent about it. And so, will we see Samson in glory? I don't know. We'll have to leave that to the Lord. But we get to this point. Samson comes to the conclusion of his life. You read in 2 Chronicles chapter 9, start at verse 29. The rest of the acts of Solomon from first to last, are they not written in the history of Nathan the prophet, and in the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, and in the visions of Iddo the seer concerning Jeroboam the son of Nebat? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years, and Solomon slept with his fathers, was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. So we have a couple of interesting things to just pay attention to here. Number one, the inspired writer makes mention of other records that would have been available to these people at this time. Given that 1st and 2nd Chronicles were written almost certainly after captivity and restoration, probably by Ezra, as the tradition says, these would be records that would be available to the Jews in that time that they could have cross-referenced and consulted and so forth. But Rehoboam comes to the throne. Now, in 1 Kings, in chapter 12, you have the beginning of Rehoboam's reign. The parallel starts in 2 Chronicles chapter 10. Oh, here's Rex coming in. So whether you're in 1 Kings 12 or 2 Kings 10, parallel accounts at this point, Rehoboam goes to Shechem. All Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. Now this is interesting, because where is Shechem? Shechem is not Jerusalem. Shechem, on this very crudely drawn map, would be, roughly speaking, right about here, over close to the Jordan River, not at Jerusalem, not at Samaria, actually about in the geographic middle of the land of promise, roughly speaking. Why would he go to Shechem? All Israel gathers there to make him king. Well, there are several possible explanations, several reasonable explanations that we might give some thought to. One of which is simply the territory, the terrain. That's part of the Jordan Plain. That's the lowlands along the river. That's an area, frankly, where huge masses of people could gather. Jerusalem, on the other hand, at this point in time, Jerusalem is the capital, the temple is there, the palace is there. It's a walled city, but it's a little, relatively speaking, a piddly sized little city. It's a few hundred acres at best. Where the plains along the Jordan River, that's an area where literally tens of thousands of people could gather and have room. Now, the very next thing that we read, he comes to Shechem so that they can make him king, Rehoboam. And Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from the presence of King Solomon. Jeroboam dwelt in Egypt, and they sent and called him. Well, who is this Jeroboam? He's described as the son of Nebat. That's his family heritage. But we've seen him before. Who is this guy? He's been one of Solomon's administrators, not just a servant, but a very capable administrator for Solomon. But he's had a falling out with Solomon, and he had to flee to Egypt because his life was in danger from Solomon. Solomon was after him. They sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all Israel came. Wonder who the they is.
Joab is dead.
No, Joab's already dead. Solomon had taken care of him according to David's instructions. Back up here in 2 Chronicles chapter 9 or in 1 Kings chapter 11, and you look at Solomon's wealth, and you back up before that, you've got the Queen of Sheba, and you cut back into 2 Chronicles chapter 8, and we're reading about all of Solomon's accomplishments. He's at the end of 20 years, he's finished the house of the Lord. He's finished his own house. He's settled all the people and whatnot, and he's begun to solidify his rulership. And what do we find? He's building storage cities. He's building great buildings and so forth, building reinforcements, and he's conquering people. And what else is he doing? He's got part of a standing army and chariots and horsemen. And now he's beginning to get into idolatry with his foreign wives and all of these sorts of things. He's raising labor forces. He's becoming staggeringly wealthy through trade and taxation. Over here in chapter 9, verse 13, the weight of the gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, thousands of pounds of gold, and all of these various things. Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom, chapter 9 and verse 22 in 2 Chronicles. All the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, and so forth.
Do you think that 666 talents of gold means anything? Isn't that kind of interesting?
Well, that's a good question. Do the 666, does that number 666 with the talents of gold, does that have any significance? It's interesting because of the association that we have with that number. And get over to the Revelation, we associate that with Mark of the Beast and so forth. And the religious world tends to zero in on things like that and try to make connections. One of the important lessons that we need to keep in mind in reading and interpreting apocalyptic literature, figurative literature, like parts of Daniel and parts of Ezekiel and the book of Revelation, for example, one of the principles of understanding these letters is that sometimes the numbers have significance beyond just the number, like in the Revelation. Sometimes they're just numbers. And there are coincidences. And in my judgment, it is just my judgment, this is a coincidence here, because if there were significance, some sort of spiritual significance to it being 666 talents, then there should also be some sort of significance to 200 shields and 600 shekels and 300 shekels and so forth. It's out of character for symbolic literature for one symbol to pop up in the middle of a bunch of things that are not symbolic. And we don't associate these other numbers with any particular symbolism. Well, all of this time, Solomon is increasing and growing ever more prosperous, ever more powerful and influential. But he's also bearing down more and more and more, not just on the people that he's conquered, but on his own people. Not in the same way. You know, he puts into slavery some of the conquered foreign peoples. He drafts some of his own people, but they're not slaves. They're I think, Ms. Shante, I think you used the term indentured servants last week, and that's probably as good a description as we'd find. They're not removed from their homes. They're not removed from their families. They're not taken to another land. They're paid, but it's a little bit like being drafted into the army. You got a letter from the president. You get a letter from the king, basically, and your service is required. Well, naturally, a whole lot of folks, by the time Solomon actually dies, a whole lot of folks are not too happy about all this. Rehoboam becomes king at Shechem, and Jeroboam, who had been, up to a point, had been a faithful servant of Solomon, but who had then objected to some of Solomon's practices and had to flee for his life because he made his opinion known. Jeroboam is called back from Egypt. Who called him? I don't know. They called him. Well, they would seem to be the people who had gathered at Shechem to make Rehoboam king. What did they call him for? They wanted him, an excellent administrator, a very competent manager, formerly a very effective servant for King Solomon. They drafted him basically to be their spokesman. This would be somebody that would be familiar to Rehoboam. This would be somebody that is, roughly speaking, Rehoboam's age, same generation, it would seem. It may well be that they would have thought, okay, Rehoboam will listen to this guy. He'll relate to him and listen to him. That may have been the thing, speculation here, of course, but they seem to put Jeroboam out there in front as their spokesman. Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 10, and down here at verse 3 and verse 4, they called Rehoboam out of Egypt, Jeroboam rather, and they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all Israel came and said to Rehoboam, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore, lighten the load, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you. So, what's the appeal? Pull back on the reins a little bit. Give us a little breathing space. Your father, your dad was taxing us into oblivion. Give us a little breathing room. Come to me again in 3 days. And the people went away. So that's a reasonable request. Let me have some time to think about this. Let me consult my advisors and so forth. And of course, we know the outcome of this. Rehoboam took counsel with the old men who had stood before Solomon his father. What do you think I ought to do? What's the consensus? pull back, lighten the load. Take some of the load off of them. And look at verse 7 in 2 Chronicles 10. If you will be good to this people and please them and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. The king is ultimately supposed to be the servant of the people. He rules them, but it's supposed to be for their good, not his, or not his alone. These older men are reminding him of that. But he abandoned the counsel that the old men gave him and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. Now, Jeroboam would seem to be in this same age group, but he's not one of the young men who had grown up with him. Jeroboam was out working for a living. Rehoboam grew up in the palace. How much hard experience did Rehoboam have? We have no way of knowing, but it becomes clear that if he had a good education, he apparently didn't have much good sense to go with it, which is ironic in a way, because if you take your Bible and flip over to the book of Ecclesiastes for just a moment, look at the beginning of the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And then that statement, vanity of vanities and so forth. Get down to verse 12. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of men to be busy with. And so on he goes. But as we go along through the book of Ecclesiastes, we have the various statements about wisdom, about righteous men and unrighteous men and so forth. And then we get down here to chapter 12. And where does chapter 12 begin? Actually, if you back up into chapter 11 at verse 9, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. Remove vexation from your heart, put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are vanity. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, when of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them, and so forth. So one of the motives of Solomon writing Ecclesiastes seems to be wisdom for his son. Go back to the book of Proverbs, to the beginning of the book of Proverbs. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. To know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, equity, and so forth. Skip down to chapter 1 and verse 8. And what does Solomon write? Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck, and so forth. Solomon, seemingly at the height of his power and wisdom, writes these books in part for what? It would seem for the benefit of Rehoboam. Apparently, Rehoboam didn't pay much attention. Well, we get back over here to 2 Chronicles chapter 10 to 1 Kings chapter 12. Go 3 days, come back, I'll give you an answer. Old men, what do you say? Lighten up. Young men, what do you say? And look at the young men's perspective at verses 9 and 10. He said to the young men, what do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, lighten the yoke that your father put on us? The young men who had grown up with him said to him, thus shall you say to the people who said to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us. Thus shall you say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. And now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. In other words, the old men said, pay attention, give them some breathing space, and they will be faithful to you all of your life. The young men said, you better show them just how tough you are. You better get your bluff in on them now while you can. Well, the third day, with Jeroboam, apparently the spokesman, the elders, the leaders of the people come back. What's your answer? I'm going to tighten the screws. I'm going to add to your burden. I'm going to load you down. Notice down here at verse 15, the statement is, so the king did not listen to the people. The king did not listen. He was foolish. Jeroboam had been a worker, an officer for Solomon. God had already revealed to Jeroboam what was going to happen. And so with the meeting with Ahijah, the prophet, back there in 1 Kings chapter 11, at verses 29 and through 39, tore the garment up, pick up 10 pieces, I'll give you 10 tribes. But Jeroboam comes as the spokesman. Rehoboam has a chance to avert all of this. And he blew it. When all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, what portion have we in David? Why should we stick with you, basically? Rehoboam seemed to show wisdom initially. Give me 3 days. Let me go ask counsel. Let me ask for advice. So that's a good plan. But it seems clear he already knows what his friend's advice is going to be. He asks the old men, and the young men say, basically, we've got a good thing going. You've got a good thing going. Let's just improve it. You've got this much coming in. Let's just take more. Let's just increase what we can get out of the people. Well, the people's response, we quit. It's interesting, the last year or so here in the nation, we've had what's being called the Great Resignation going on, where people are dropping out of the workforce, taking time off, taking a sabbatical, just sitting back and trying to reset their lives. All of this pandemic for a lot of people has been kind of an opportunity to step back and take a look at their lives and say, I don't like what I'm doing. I think I'm going to take a break and find something else. And so we've got labor shortages and so forth. Well, these people weren't exactly in the same situation, but they said, we've decided we're not going to work under these conditions anymore. And so they quit. They didn't just quit working for Rehoboam. They quit Rehoboam. They quit the kingdom. Now, this young man, had he not had foolish friends backing him up, might have avoided this foolishness altogether. But here, they reinforced his worst instincts, where the older men were trying to bring out his better instincts. At verse 17 down here, all of these people were ruled by Rehoboam. Regardless of the tribe, all of those who lived in Judah. You look at verse 17. Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah, regardless of tribe. It was not just the tribe, not just the people of the tribe of Judah, but the Levites and the Benjaminites and any others from the other 10 tribes who were living in Judah. Okay, Rehoboam is still their king. Well, how so? Well, look at the map. This is Judah. They're living in his territory. They don't have much choice. But what's going to happen? The other 10 tribes, those to the north, they've just said sayonara to his rulership. So at verse 18, Rehoboam seems to see his mistake. Look at verses 18 and 19. King Rehoboam sent Hadoram, who was taskmaster over the forced labor, and the people of Israel stoned him to death with stones. Now, you remember Adoram? Same guy. Hadoram, as he's called here in 2 Chronicles, Adoram. He had been an honorable servant of Solomon, it seems. Rehoboam sends him out to be point man on trying to smooth things over. It didn't end well for him. King Rehoboam quickly mounted his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Now that's an interesting thing to say and an interesting way to put it, because what is this day there at the end of verse 19? When is this day? It would be the time of the writer, who's probably Ezra, writing after Babylonian captivity and the restoration. So we're 400 years removed almost from Rehoboam's time. All the years of kings from Solomon down to Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, and all of the years of captivity and then of the restoration period up to this time frame of Ezra. And he says, so Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David. They have been unfaithful, basically, all this time. Well, let's think for a minute about what's involved in that. They pulled away from the throne. They are about to set up their own nation, their own kingdom, their own religion, false religion. They're going to turn their back on the God who promises to bless them if they'll be faithful. And they're going to exist as a separate nation until they're demolished by the Assyrians. But in all of this, from a human perspective, they're unfaithful to David's lineage. Now, at the time that this is being written, there is no king. There hasn't been a king for over 100 years. There's not going to be a king on a throne in Jerusalem until Herod, and Herod's an illegitimate king, and his successors are. Jesus is the ultimate king to whom they're looking forward, but they don't know him by that name, and they don't recognize him by the identity that he will take on. When the writer says they're in rebellion until this day, in essence, what he's saying is that they've been in rebellion against God all along. They've turned their back on God. So, we've got the arrogance of Rehoboam and his young advisors. The foolishness, he sends Adoram out to try to bully them, try to smooth things over enough to get them to accept him, and they stoned him. And now, if Rehoboam stays there, it's not going to be safe. So he hops in the chariot and away we go. The only alternative he has, basically, to surrendering to his own people. Suppose he had surrendered to them. Had he given in to their request, had he reversed course at this point and given in to them, would that have changed things?
I believe that it would have, because God is always welcoming a person to repent. But it also says that God raises up who he will to accomplish whatever he's planning to accomplish. And I think he knew exactly how Rehoboam was going to react.
I think you're right on both counts. Number one, he could have turned things around, but number two, God knew providentially that he wasn't going to. Ego is a terrible thing. The funny thing about that, ego is a two-edged sword. It takes a certain amount of ego just for us to function in this world, doesn't it? Ego or self-confidence. You have to have a certain amount of self-confidence just to get behind the wheel of an automobile and pilot it down the highway, don't you? If you're not confident that you can do that safely, you better not drive. It takes a certain amount of ego for a man to stand up in a Bible class or in an auditorium and preach a sermon telling people how they ought to live. But you get too much of that ego, and what do you wind up with? You wind up with Jim Baker or somebody like that. Rehoboam had too much ego and not enough humility. So, none but the tribe of Judah are going to accept him now. Judah, that is going to include the little tribe of Benjamin and whatever Israelites are living there. But at this point, the nation divides. 10 tribes to the north form Israel, or they're sometimes described as Ephraim, because Ephraim is the most populous of the 10 tribes. And 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin to the south, are also known as David, or the house of David. You look down here in 1 Kings chapter 12 and get to verse 21. When Rehoboam was come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men who were warriors. So he's got 180,000 soldiers just out of his own tribe, plus some Benjaminites. And they're ready to fight the house of Israel to bring the kingdom together again, to be under his rulership. He's going to try to force the 10 tribes to submit. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, saying, "Speak to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and unto all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and the rest of the people, saying, Thus saith the Lord, you shall not go up, nor fight against your brethren, the children of Israel. Return every man to his house, for this thing is of me." So they hearkened to the word of the Lord and returned and went their way according to the word of the Lord. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 11, you have the parallel account here. Rehoboam is ready to pick a fight, ready to try to force his will on the people. And that really just shows how stupid he is. in one sense. When David, near the end of his reign, took that ill-advised census, how many soldiers was he able to field before the Lord sent the plague and killed 70,000 of them? It was almost 1.6 million, 1,570,000. And the Lord took 70,000 of them with the plague. David had 1.5 million soldiers. Of those, over 500,000 of them were from the tribe of Judah. So he had a huge army in his day, if he needed it, just among his own kinfolks in Judah. But even so, had Judah fought the other 10 tribes, they'd have been outnumbered 2-1. Now, God plus 1 makes a majority. Solomon had a huge number of soldiers at his disposal, and he put most of his effort into trade and business rather than warfare. He did subdue all the neighboring nations, but once he had them under his thumb, he was done making war, basically. We come along to Rehoboam, and you've got 180,000. Something has changed pretty dramatically over about 60 years' time, 50 to 60 years' time. A lot fewer soldiers than in King David's day. Now, this is the only mention of Shemaiah, the prophet, in this particular context. There's no other reference to him anywhere, but his word is accepted by the people and they withdraw. And as we begin then at 2 Chronicles 11 and verse 5, Rehoboam has returned to Jerusalem. He's back in the palace. That's where he grew up. And notice what he begins to do. He builds defensive cities. Now, he doesn't build these cities from scratch. He takes existing cities and fortifies them. Bethlehem, Etam, Tekoa, Bethjur, Soko, Adullam, Gath, Marishah, Ziph, Adaraim, Lachish, Azekah, Zorah, Aijalon, Hebron, fortified cities in Judah and Benjamin. So basically what he does is to build a ring of fortified cities, a ring of walled cities around Jerusalem for his own protection. He made the fortresses strong, put commanders in them, stores of food and oil and wine, shields and spears, and he held on to Judah and Benjamin. Well, that was according to God's will that he held on to them. It's interesting, though, to think about what he's doing here. Rehoboam does not seem to be consulting God in this at all, does he? He takes measures to establish his kingdom, to reinforce things, and then the scenery changes. If you go over to 1 Kings chapter 12 for just a moment, let me stick a marker in here and flip back. The scenery changes. Now we're going to be looking at Jeroboam. And Jeroboam becomes the king of the northern kingdom, the king of Israel. Rehoboam has made his foolish decisions. And now you start in 1 Kings 12 and about verse 25. The 10 tribes have abandoned Rehoboam. They've all gone home. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. So we're up here in the hill country, on the edge of the hill country in Ephraim, that spot not far from the Jordan River, a place where the multitudes were able to gather. And that becomes the beginnings of Jeroboam's kingdom. Goes out and builds Penuel. He begins to do all of the things that Rehoboam is doing. Fortifying, reinforcing, preparing himself to hold on. Now, what does Jeroboam know that maybe Rehoboam has no clue about? That what he's doing so far is God's will. He's had the promise of 10 tribes from God. But what goes with that? A promise and a warning. If you will be faithful to me, I'll establish your kingdom, your lineage, your house, just like David's. Now, David's is the seed line for the Christ. But if you'll be faithful, I'll make yours just like David's in every other respect. For whatever reason, Jeroboam is a much better politician than he is faithful servant of God. Because you look at 1 Kings chapter 12, at verse 26, Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Right here in those words is the root of Jeroboam's downfall. He did not believe what God promised him. He did not believe God's promise. God promised, I'll build your kingdom. I'll establish your dynasty. Your sons will rule after you. He didn't believe God. He could have had it all. And he did not believe. And so because he did not believe, what did he do? Well, the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. Said to the people, you've gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Now think about this for a minute. You look at the map, and of course, Jerusalem down here in the southern kingdom, in the hill country of Judea. Jerusalem is functionally the highest point in the land geographically until you get way up here into the Lebanon, anti-Lebanon mountains that aren't actually a part of Israel. So it's the highest point for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles around. Anytime they go to Jerusalem to sacrifice, it's literally uphill all the way, no matter where they're coming from. It's an awkward place to get to for them. It's inconvenient to have to go clear from Dan way up here in the north down to Jerusalem, or from way over here in Manasseh across the river into Judea to get to Jerusalem and so forth. It's too much trouble. You've gone there long enough. Behold, your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. A golden calf at Dan in the north, a golden calf at Bethel in the south. And he gave credit for what God did to these golden calves that his own workmen made. Your gods, plural, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Notice down here at verse 30, this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before one. He also made temples on high places and appointed priests from among all the people who were not of the Levites. Now, bear in mind that as he's doing this, as he's setting this up, who is still living in cities scattered among all of the tribes that Jeroboam rules?
Levites.
Levites. When Joshua led the people into the land of promise, there were 48 cities set aside for the Levites. The Levites didn't get any contiguous territory like the other tribes did. They got 48 cities that were scattered through everybody else's territory because they're supposed to be the leavening influence, the positive influence for the whole rest of the nation. They're the tribe of priests and of religious leaders. So here's Jeroboam setting up this idolatry, this false religion, basically right in their faces. And he appoints priests who are not priests at all, according to the will of God. He creates a priesthood where anybody that wants to can be a priest. Doesn't matter what your background is. He appointed a day, a feast on the 15th day of the month, like the feast that was in Judah. He offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he made, placed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he made. He went up to the altar that he made in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month that he had devised in his own heart, instituted a feast for the people of Israel, and went up to the altar to make offerings. What you have here, starting at verse 25 and going down to the end of the chapter, is an excellent example of what the Apostle Paul mentions over in Colossians chapter 2 and verse 23. Paul talks about will worship. They worship their own will. They worship what they want. What I want is the most important thing. That's what Paul is describing. That's what Jeroboam is doing here. Why does Jeroboam create this false religion? To keep them from going to Jerusalem, to keep them from mingling with Judah, to establish his hold politically and militarily. Why does Jeroboam do this? Because he does not believe God's promise. That's really what it all comes down to right there. He does not trust God. So we'll see in chapter 13, 1 Kings, and over here in, it'll be chapter 11 and chapter 12 parallels this in 2 Chronicles. We'll see God's response, primarily here in 1 Kings chapter 12. It is 20 till 8. It's time to take a break. So questions or comments before we do?
Words of Solomon, unless the Lord builds the house, they build in vain.
That's right.
The Lord watches the city, the watchmen are watching in vain.
You're right. You leave the Lord out of your plans, you're just wasting your time making plans. That's right. God, that's a good way to put it. God laughs at your plans when you don't consider the Lord. You're wasting your effort. We'll stop here.
My sound's working.
Hey, great, Rex.
I don't know why.
Good deal.
It just started. I don't know why.
Well, you just got one of those mystery computers, I guess.
Yeah.
We'll resume at 5 till 8. Started again. Recording is started. So let's divide the kingdom. We've got Jeroboam has established his false religion and pulled the 10 tribes away, just as had been prophesied. And Jeroboam has demonstrated that he's only going to believe the parts of the prophecy that suit him. He's perfectly willing to be king, but he's not willing to be a faithful king. So he's already sealed his own fate. He probably doesn't have a clue that he has, thinks that he can run things his way, but he's already determined that this is not going to end well for him. So you look at 1 Kings chapter 13, and you have here a glimpse into the northern kingdom, a period in a sense of silence. The Spirit doesn't tell us what's going on in Rehoboam's world at this time, but we get some considerable detail about Jeroboam's world. How so? Why? If you think about it, what Jeroboam has done is going to color the relations between Israel in the north and Judah in the south from this point until 721 BC, when Sennacherib and the Assyrians demolish and dismantle Israel, the northern kingdom. It's going to color everything about their relations between north and south from this point forward. So you look at chapter 13. Here comes a man of God out of Judah by the word of the Lord to Bethel. We don't know who this prophet is. He's not named at this point, but he is a man of God, and he has a prophecy concerning the altar at Bethel. And really, that extends to all of Jeroboam's religion. And the man cried against the altar by the word of the Lord. And notice what it says, what he is commanded by the Lord to say. O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who make offerings on you, and human bones shall be burned on you. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, this is the sign that the Lord has spoken. Behold, the altar shall be torn down, and the ashes that are on it shall be poured out. Well, guess what? Over in 2 Chronicles chapter 34, verse 5, and later on in 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 10, 330 years later, here's Josiah defiling this altar so that it can never be used again for worship. The interesting thing about this is that 21 times in the New Testament, we find Jeroboam mentioned. And every time he's mentioned, he is not just Jeroboam, he is Jeroboam who taught Israel to sin, or Jeroboam who caused Israel to sin. That is going to cling to his name, just like a last name practically, from this point forward. Now, when the king heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried out against the altar at Bethel, Jeroboam stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, seize him. And his hand, which he stretched out against him, dried up or withered so that he could not draw it back to himself. You would think that that would get his attention. You would think that that would turn him around. And it doesn't. It doesn't. Now, the altar also was torn down, the ashes poured out according to the sign that the man of God had given by the word of the Lord. And now that Jeroboam can't use that hand anymore, now entreat the favor of the Lord your God, and pray for me that my hand may be restored. And the man of God entreated the Lord, and the king's hand was restored and became as before. But notice, Jeroboam's attitude doesn't seem to change in all of this. He wants the blessing, but he's not interested in giving the submission to God that should be associated with that. It's very much a one-way street for him. The sign is fulfilled. Jeroboam recognizes God's power. He respects it, but he's still trying to play politics. Go on from here. The man, Jeroboam, is healed. And the king says to him, come home with me and refresh yourself, and I will reward you. And the man of God said to the king, if you give me half your house, I will not go in with you. I will not eat bread. Oh, can't talk right now. I will not eat bread with you. I will not drink water in this place. It was commanded me by the word of the Lord not to do that. So we don't know who this man is. He is a man of God. He is a prophet, but we don't have any detail other than he was sent to utter this condemnation and to deal with Jeroboam. Jeroboam tries bribery, basically, compromise, not going to work. The man refuses based on God's specific commandments. And then at verse 11, an old prophet comes on the scene. Lived in Bethel. The old man hasn't been present for this, but his sons come and tell him what happened. And he sends word, come to my house. Why did he want the young prophet to come to his house? Which way did he go? The sons pointed him that way. Saddle the donkey for me. They got on the donkey, goes and finds the man of God sitting under an oak tree. Come home with me. I'm not supposed to go home with you. I'm supposed to go this way. And the old prophet lies. Why? Two questions. Why would the old prophet want this younger prophet to come to his house? And why would he lie to get him there? Possible, speculative, admittedly, but possible explanations. Did the old man,
Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
Well, it sounds to me like maybe he hasn't had a message from God for a long time.
Okay.
Maybe he's hoping to get that started again. Maybe he feels left out
Okay.
because another prophet's come into his territory. Just my guesses.
Little bit of ego on his part, perhaps. Guilty conscience, maybe, because he is a prophet of God. He knows what's right, and he lived right there, and seemingly he's done nothing about it. He didn't go cry out against what Jeroboam was doing, didn't rebuke Jeroboam himself. So, maybe it's guilty conscience. At this point in history, it may be something as simple as just wanting to have some fellowship, some association of someone of like mind. Although he didn't have too much of a like mind. Maybe he was wanting to learn more of what the Lord had to say. As Miss Mary was pointing out, seems that maybe the Lord hasn't spoken by him for a while, and he's, well, what's going on? I wonder why the Lord bypassed me for this. All of those are nothing but speculation. The fact of the matter is that we're not told why, only that he did. He wanted the young man to come to his house, and the young man refuses on the same grounds. God said for me to do this.
You
Now,
think he could have been tested? Do you think this was a test for him?
the old prophet? Or
No, the new one. I mean, the young one.
Well, it ends up being a test of sorts, in the same way that the Gibeonites coming to Joshua back there in Joshua, what is it, chapter 6, chapter 7? The Gibeonites coming to Joshua, oh, we're from a far, far, far away land. And, all this bread was brand new, fresh out of the oven. Our clothes were brand new, and they're all rags and tatters now. And this is moldy bread and what have you. Well, they were from 3 days away. They lied, and Joshua made a treaty with them, and then discovered they were next door neighbors. Where was Joshua's mistake?
He didn't seek God.
He didn't ask God first. This young man's mistake is the same mistake. He doesn't reconfirm with God. the older man says, well, I've had a vision from the Lord. I've had word from the Lord. You're to come home with me. A change of plans here. The older prophet's lying. And the younger prophet didn't confirm with God what was being told him. But you know, there is an important principle in play here. The Lord told the young man exactly what to do. Notice what he says to him. You look at the text. Are you the man of God who came from Judah? I am, verse 14. Come home with me and eat bread. I may not return with you, nor go in with you, neither will I eat bread nor drink water with you in this place, for it was said to me by the word of the Lord, you shall neither eat bread nor drink water there, nor return by the way that you came. All right. He has specific instructions. Nothing here to countermand that until the man lies. And he does not confirm this with God to make sure that it's true.
I have a question. It caught my attention that the prophet says an angel talked to me.
Yeah.
And the prophet that had been sent by God, I get the impression that God directly gave him the message.
If there was an angel involved, it doesn't tell us that for him.
Right. But I just wondered if that, I mean, I imagined it bothered that older prophet to lie, but to say, well, God told me would be like, well, that, I mean,
That would be an outright lie, and this is just a mild deception, that sort of thing.
yeah, in his rationalizing. But it seems to me like he's kind of tempering, and it's not right, but it's his rationalizing.
Well, it's what
an angel said it.
we always do when we're trying to excuse something that we know is wrong. We try to find some way to make it sound better for us, some way to make it seem less blatantly wrong. How many times have you heard someone refer to something as a little white lie? What is a little white lie? It's a lie, period. There's nothing little about it in God's sight, and there's nothing white about it. It's a lie is a lie is a lie is a lie. Well, this older prophet lies. And so the young man goes back and shares a meal with him. Why did he not go back to the Lord for confirmation? I don't know. Youth, ignorance. The guy had a trusting face. Maybe the young man was hungry. We don't know. But you look at verses 20 and 21 and 22. Now the old man does receive a prophecy. Don't know how long it's been since the last one. But this prophecy, this revelation, is a condemnation of the younger prophet for disobedience. Because you have disobeyed the word of the Lord and not kept the command that the Lord your God commanded you, here's what's going to happen. Your body shall not come to the tomb of your fathers. The revelation forces the truth out of the old man. And in verses 23 and 24, it's fulfilled just in short order. After he had eaten bread and drunk, he saddled the donkey for the prophet whom he had brought back. And as he went away, a lion met him on the road and killed him. His body was thrown in the road. The donkey stood beside it. The lion stood beside the body. Men passed by and saw the body thrown in the road, and the lion standing by the body. And they came and told it in the city where the old prophet lived. So they came and told it in Bethel, right there. News travels fast, especially when a miracle's involved. And so they go out, they recover the body, and it's buried in the old man's tomb. The young man is not buried where his ancestors would have put him. He's buried in the old prophet's tomb. They laid the body in the grave, verse 30, and mourned over him, saying, Alas, my brother. After he had buried him, he said to his sons, When I die, you bury me in the grave which the man of God is buried. Lay my bones beside his. For the saying that he called out by the word of the Lord against the altar in Bethel, against all the houses of the high places that are in the cities of Samaria, shall surely come to pass. Boy, he is convinced now. And he knows his own treachery. He knows his own misdeeds. But isn't it interesting? He wants to be honored by being buried with a true prophet of God. He's betrayed himself in a way, but he wants some gesture of redemption. And there's a good lesson here, an important thing, that this shows us that God does not interfere with an individual's choices. The young man had a direct commandment, a direct instruction from God. He chose, even in his ignorance, still he chose to disobey by not confirming with God what he was being told. The old man had been a prophet of God. We look at him and say, should have known better, and surely he should have. The fact that he was a prophet of God did not stop him from becoming a liar and becoming responsible through his lies, through his deception, through his self-focus. God did not prevent him from misbehaving by lying to that young man. God will not violate our ability to choose right or wrong, but he will use the circumstance, even if the person is not a willing partner. Here's the old man, got the young man in his house. They're sharing a meal. It's seemingly, it's what he wanted. And then God uses him to deliver the sentence on the young man for his disobedience. We don't know that the old man was a willing party to that. It certainly was not what he would have wanted. Seemingly, he just wanted some companionship. But we come down to chapter 13 now. As we get to the end of this, after this thing, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way. What thing? Well, Jeroboam has instituted his false religion. He has challenged God. He has been rebuked by this young prophet. His hand has been withered and restored by the power of God, and he still does not repent. He still does not turn back. He made priests for the high places again from among all the people. Anybody that wanted to, he ordained to be priests of the high places. And this thing became sin to the house of Jeroboam, so as to cut it off and to destroy it from the face of the earth. That statement at the end of chapter 13 anticipates the Assyrians in 721 BC. That statement is the root of the destruction of the northern kingdom. And the northern kingdom will never, ever, ever again exist as a nation. Some remnants of them will return with Judah after their captivity. And we'll find members of different tribes intermingled with Judah in New Testament time, but they'll never exist as a nation ever again, specifically because of this. So, the consequences of his sins, his choices and his sins are going to be visited upon him and his children. Chapter 14, Abijah, the son of Jeroboam, fell sick, said to his wife, go disguise yourself. Don't let it be known that you're my wife. You go to Shiloh. Behold, Ahijah, the prophet, is there. So you've got the son's name is Abiah with a B. The prophet's name is Ahiah or Ahijah with an H. Very similar. Both names are associated with God. And you go find the prophet of God at Shiloh, Ahiah. Take a bribe, take a payment, 10 loaves and some cakes and honey, and he'll tell you what will happen to the child. Now, you have to wonder a little bit about Jeroboam's thinking here. Don't tell anybody who you are. Does he think that that she's going to be able to hide her identity from Ahijah, the prophet? You get down to verse 4, one of the things we discover, Ahijah is old enough, he's blind with old age. He can't see clearly. His eyes were dim because of his age. You take loaves and crumbs or cakes and honey, that's not a kingly gift. That's a poor woman's gift. Go in disguise. Who's he trying to hide from? It might be that Jeroboam thinks that he can disguise from the prophet who his wife is and who this child is that he's inquiring about. But he certainly can't hide it from God. Another possibility, in my judgment, it might be the more likely explanation. Jeroboam has devoted himself to setting up this ridiculous false religion. And now what's he doing? His son is sick, and where's he turning for information? He's turning to a genuine prophet of God. How would that look to all of his people whom he has drawn into this false religion? Well, that's a betrayal of everything he's created. That shows that he doesn't have much faith in his own supposed gods. So it may well be that his concern is more for his reputation among his subjects than it is for trying to conceal his identity from the prophet, or at least from God at any rate. So she goes, she takes the gift. Ahijah is blinded by age. And notice what the Lord does. The Lord has a sense of humor. The Lord said to Ahijah, Jeroboam's wife is coming, and she's going to ask you about her son who's sick. Here's what you tell her. So, the message is not good. The news is not good. It's not what Jeroboam wants to hear. So you look at the account here. Notice she gets to the door before she can even knock. Come in, Mrs. Jeroboam. Why are you pretending to be who you're not? I have heavy tidings. I've got bad news for you, lady. The English Standard is interesting here. It says, I am charged with unbearable news for you. And here's the unbearable news. You go tell Jeroboam, thus says the Lord, because I exalted you, I lifted you up from among the people, made you leader over my people, Israel, and tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. Yet you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commandments and followed me with all his heart, doing only that which was right in my eyes. You've done evil above all who were before you, and have gone and made for yourself other gods and metal images, provoking me to anger, and so forth. Therefore, behold, I will bring down upon the house of Jeroboam, I will bring harm upon the house of Jeroboam, and cut off from Jeroboam every male, both bond and free in Israel, and burn up the house of Jeroboam as a man burns up dung until it is gone. Anyone belonging to Jeroboam who dies in the city, the dogs shall eat. And anyone who dies in the open country, the buzzards shall eat, birds of the heavens shall eat. The Lord has spoken it. Not good news. Yeah, the child that they're concerned about, that child's going to die. When your feet enter the city, lady, when you get back home, as soon as you hit the front gate, child's going to die. And the Lord will raise up a king over Israel who will cut off the house of Jeroboam that day. What was the promise that God had given to Jeroboam? If you're faithful, I'll make your house, I'll make your family lineage just like David's, just as certain, as established as David's. You're not faithful, I'm going to cut you off at the roots. There will be no second generation of the house of Jeroboam. Well, that's exactly what's going to take place then. The cutting off of Jeroboam's house will be complete. Flip over to chapter 15 in 1 Kings for just a minute and look at verses 27 through 29. You get over here, Baasha, the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar. Now, this is not Ahijah the prophet. This is a different Ahijah. Of the house of Issachar conspired against him, against Jeroboam, struck him down at Gibbethon, which belongs to the Philistines, for Nadab and all Israel were there laying siege to Gibbethon. So Baasha killed him in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his place. So not only are all of his offspring going to be cut off, but he's going to come to a violent end himself. The Lord revealed the plot to the prophet, gave him the bad news. All the male heirs are going to be taken away, just taken out like refuse, like trash. Not one of them gets an honorable death. Not one. And here's how you know that this is going to happen. As soon as your feet hit the city, your boy's going to die. Well, now, back up here in chapter 14 and notice in verse 13, all Israel shall mourn for him, for that child, and bury him, for he only of Jeroboam shall come to the grave, because in him there is found something pleasing to the Lord, the God of Israel, in the house of Jeroboam. How old is the child? No clue. Don't know if he's a baby or a toddler or a little boy, or if he's at this point a grown adult. Don't know if he's born before or after Jeroboam became king. Jeroboam is going to reign for 22 years, according to 2 Chronicles chapter 13 and verse 20. So he's not anywhere near the end of his reign at this point. But this child, maybe his firstborn, I don't know. This child is the only one who dies an honorable death in a sense. He's the only one who's going to be mourned of all of Jeroboam's house. And on top of that, you just keep reading. Here's what's going to happen to the nation because of you, Jeroboam, verses 15 and 16. The Lord will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water, root up Israel out of this good land and scatter them beyond the Euphrates, because they have made their Asherim, provoking the Lord to anger. In other words, because of your idolatry, this is what you've done. You have sealed the fate of your nation. Actions have consequences, don't they? Actions have consequences. Now, The sign is fulfilled. The child dies. He is mourned. And then we come to the death of Jeroboam. The rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he warred and reigned, are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. The time that Jeroboam reigned was 22 years. He slept with his fathers, and Nadab, his son, reigned in his place. But Nadab is not going to reign for long. Nadab is going to be taken out of the way. Now the picture shifts back at this point to Rehoboam. All this has been, in one sense, setting the stage, you might say, for where Judah will go from here. Remember, the parallel between Kings and Chronicles is that Kings gives us the politics of the two nations side by side, and Chronicles is focused primarily on Judah, and it's told, the history is told from a priestly point of view, basically. Ezra's point of view as a priest. But here, as we go forward, the picture shifts back south to Rehoboam. Rehoboam was 41 when he began to reign. So he wasn't as young as we speculated a moment ago, was he? That means that he was born the year before Solomon actually became king. Solomon must have started young. He reigned 17 years. His mother was an Ammonite. And he was not good for Judah. The queen mother of each king in Judah is named. The mothers of the kings in Israel are not. The kings in Israel, from Jeroboam moving forward, from his offspring after he's cut off, the kings in Israel are all basically illegitimate in that they are walking in Jeroboam's footsteps. Every king of Israel is going to be an idolater. Every king of Israel is going to be a wicked man. In Judah, you're going to see the ball bounce up and down and up and down. And sometimes it's up a couple in a row and sometimes it's down several in a row. But they're going to ping pong back and forth between righteous and unrighteous men. Israel doesn't have that benefit. They are consistently bad. The queen mother being named tells us something about the influence of a wife over her husband. You think about Solomon, all the wives he had, even David before him. Bathsheba was Solomon's mother. But as the mother trains the child, so the nation goes. Bathsheba, regardless of the fact that she had been married to a Hittite man, Uriah, who was a loyal subject of David, regardless of the fact that she had been, whether it was complicit in adultery or seduced by the king in fear of his power or whatnot, Bathsheba seems to have been basically a righteous woman. Solomon starts out on a good foot, and it's only after he marries these foreign women that his heart is ultimately turned away from the Lord. As the queen, as the mother trains the king, to a large degree, that's how the kingdom goes in his generation. It would seem that Naamah, the Amorite mother of Rehoboam, was not a good influence. So as we look through 2 Chronicles, we start to read about chapter 11 over here in 2 Chronicles. We start to read about Rehoboam's fortifications, the things that he's doing by way of reinforcing. And we talked about that a minute ago, the cities that he built, the fortifications that he built, the way he ringed his kingdom basically with fortresses that would be hard to overcome, hard to take, and would provide a measure of defense. And then you skip down a little bit in 2 Chronicles chapter 11, and notice you read about Rehoboam's family. So in 2 Chronicles 11, pick up at verse 18. Rehoboam took as a wife Mahalath, the daughter of Jeremoth, the son of David, and Abihail, the wife of Eliab, the son of Jesse. So the two girls that he marries are actually cousins, grandchildren or children of the two brothers, David and his oldest brother Eliab. After her, he took Maacah, the daughter of Absalom, who bore him Abijah. There's a similar name, just like Jeroboam's son. So he's got sons by these first wives, Jeush, Shemariah, Zahim. Then he marries Maacah, and she has Abijah, Attai, Ziza, Shalomit. Rehoboam loved Maacah, the daughter of Absalom, above all his wives and concubines. He took 18 wives and 60 concubines, fathered 28 sons and 60 daughters. Well, I wonder where he learned that. Learned that from Solomon and David before him. But notice what it says about him. It's interesting. Now, Rehoboam is going to want to make his son Abijah king in his stead. We'll get to that in just a second. But notice it says that he appointed Abijah, the son of Maacah, as chief prince. He intended to make him king, and he dealt wisely and distributed some of his sons through all the districts of Judah and Benjamin, in all the fortified cities, and gave them abundant provisions and procured wives for them. Rehoboam was not altogether stupid. He had some ambition, and by spreading his sons out, he's got 28 sons, and he wants this one to be king. Get the others out away from Jerusalem. He's isolating the others basically where they can't really build a coalition against Abijah. Notice at verse 13, he grew strong, chapter 12 and verse 13, he grew strong in Jerusalem and reigned. So he's consolidating what he's got. He's lost 3/4 of the country, lost probably 9/10 of the overall population by his stubbornness and arrogance. But he's going to secure what he does have. He's going to try to hold on to what he has left. And you come into chapter 12. He's strong, he's established, and what does he do? Turns away from the Lord. He abandoned the law of the Lord and all Israel with him. Now we're talking about Rehoboam here, not Jeroboam, but all Israel with him. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, because they had been unfaithful to the Lord, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen. And the people were without number who came with him from Egypt. Libyans, Sukkim, Ethiopians, and he took the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. So Rehoboam has set the stage for his nation, instead of ruling the neighboring nations, to become a tributary to some of the neighboring nations. Rehoboam wanted to make Abijah king. He takes steps to do that, but in the meantime, he turns the nation away. Flip back over to 1 Kings for just a minute. and look at 1 Kings, and we're going to be in chapter 14 at verses 22, 23, 24. You have a more detailed description here. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite. Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, provoked him to jealousy with their sins that they committed, more than all that their fathers had done. They also built for themselves high places and pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there were also male cult prostitutes. That's the English Standard rendering there, in the land. They did according to all the abominations of the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. So, under Rehoboam's leadership, they basically become a copy of Jeroboam's nation. The only difference, the only thing that separates them is that they don't just outright abandon, reject the Lord and his temple and so forth. They indulge in everything that Israel does, all the pagan peoples around them. But basically the difference is Israel, the northern kingdom, rejected God entirely. Judah just piled all this other nonsense on top of God, as it were. The temple is still there. The priests and the priesthood are still there. They're just basically being ignored at this point. The high places were places for idolatrous worship. The sacred pillars or the images, those were things that were erected where they supposedly had visions or revelations. Originally, when God sent a vision, it had been customary to memorialize that with some kind of a marker or an altar of some sort, much like Jacob had done at Bethel back in his day. But these were being placed by false prophets, false religion, and you couldn't tell the difference between the true and the false once they were there. They practice homosexuality, cult prostitution, sodomy, all the evils of the heathens. And what happens? Here come the Egyptians. Now, the interesting thing about Shishak or Shishak is that his purpose is not conquest, really. His purpose is to plunder. He's just going to go in and plunder the land, and then he's going home. He's going to take whatever he can get, leave them impoverished, and then he's going to turn around and go home. So he comes up and he conquers Rehoboam's fortified cities. He comes to Jerusalem. And notice at 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 5, Shemaiah the prophet. Now this would seem to be the same Shemaiah. Comes to Rehoboam and the princes of Judah and says, "You've abandoned the Lord. So the Lord has abandoned you to the hand of Shishak." Now God has their attention. And so the princes of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, "The Lord is righteous." When the Lord saw that they humbled themselves, the word of the Lord came to Shemaiah, "They have humbled themselves. I will not destroy them, but grant them some deliverance." I'm not going to undo this altogether, but I'll give them some relief. My wrath shall not be poured out by the hand of Shishak. Nevertheless, they shall be servants to him, that they may know my service and the service of the kingdoms of the countries. They had been slaves in Egypt once before. Now they're going to get a taste of it again, although not in Egypt. And notice what happens here at verse 9. We talked about the wealth of Solomon a while ago. Solomon being just astonishingly rich. Verse 9, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. he took away the treasures of the king's house, the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. The shields of gold that Solomon had made, and King Rehoboam made in their place shields of bronze and committed them to the hands of the officers of the guard who kept the doors of the king's house. As often as the king went into the house of the Lord, the guard came and carried them and brought them back to the guard room. And he humbled himself. And when he humbled himself, the wrath of the Lord turned from him so as not to make a complete destruction. Moreover, conditions were good in Judah. Turn things around and God leaves off. Where did Solomon's fabulous wealth go? Egypt. You know, legend has the story of King Solomon's fortune and King Solomon's mines and all this other stuff. And it's been the stuff of adventure movies and things like that. There is no store of wealth squirreled away somewhere from Solomon's day. Shishak took it to Egypt. He plundered Jerusalem because Judah had sinned. And it wasn't just the king, it was all the leadership and the nation behind them. As the leadership goes, so goes the nation. Judah sinned, and so they were plundered. And notice the golden shields are taken, replaced with brass shields or bronze. And where are they kept now? You know, they keep them in the guardhouse now. They keep them under lock and key, where before they were on public display. And so you come to the end of the chapter here. King Rehoboam grew strong, reigned, 41 years old when he began, 17 years. So he's 58 when he dies. And he did evil. He did not set his heart to seek the Lord. Now there's a point that we'll come back to again and again as we look at these kings. The setting of the heart, the attitude of the heart is the key to everything else in the man. Where your treasure is where your heart will be also. His treasure was on earth, not in heaven. And that tells us everything right there. You continue on here. The acts of Rehoboam from first to last, are they not written in the Chronicles of Shemaiah the prophet and Iddo the seer? There were continual wars between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Rehoboam slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, and Abijah, his son, reigned in his place. Now, here's you a little tidbit of irony. Think about this. How long did Rehoboam reign? 17 years after Solomon died. How long did Jeroboam reign? Jeroboam, the unrighteous king, lasted 5 years longer, reigned 22 years. So in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, Abijah began to reign over Judah, and he reigned for 3 years. There was war between Abijah and Jeroboam. Abijah went out to battle, having an army of valiant men of war, 400,000 chosen men. Jeroboam drew up his line of battle against him with 800,000. Now, war between them. This is more animosity, conflict, than actual physical war. This is more posturing and threatening. It's this is like Putin and the Ukrainians at this point. So Abijah is trying to show how tough he is. Abijah stood up on Mount Zemaraim, that's in the hill country of Ephraim. Hear me, O Jeroboam and all Israel. Ought you not to know that the Lord God of Israel gave the kingship over Israel forever to David and his sons by a covenant of salt? Yet Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, a servant of Solomon, the son of David, rose up and rebelled, and certain worthless scoundrels gathered about him and defied Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, when Rehoboam was young and irresolute and could not withstand them. And now you think to withstand the kingdom of the Lord in the land of the sons of David, because you are a great multitude and have with you the golden calves that Jeroboam made you for gods? Have you not driven out the priests of the Lord, the sons of Aaron, and the Levites, and made priests for yourselves like peoples of other lands? Whoever comes for ordination with a young bull or 7 rams becomes a priest of what are no God. Now, all of this is, you think about this, he's saying good things. He's pointing out what separates the peoples. Get down here to verse 10. Verse 10, as for us, he's comparing Israel and Judah. As for us, the Lord is our God, and we have not forsaken him. We have priests ministering to the Lord who are sons of Aaron and Levites for their service. They offer to the Lord every morning and every evening. And he goes on like this and talks about the difference between them. Those are bold words on a variety of levels. You think about where Abijah is coming from. He's Rehoboam's son, and what's Rehoboam's claim to fame as king? He's David's grandson.
Losing the kingdom.
Yeah, his claim to fame, as Mary said, basically, he lost half the kingdom. He lost 80% of the kingdom. You know, his claim to fame is he was stubborn as a mule and dumb as a post, apparently, in some ways. But here's this son, and there's conflict. He's outnumbered 2-1, and he's just throwing it right back in Jeroboam's face. And then he doesn't reign very long. Now, Jeroboam had set an ambush, and it looked like all was going to be lost for Judah. You get down here to verse 15. The men of Judah raised the battle shout, and when Judah shouted, God defeated Jeroboam and all Israel before them. The men of Israel fled, and God gave them into their hand. Abijah and his people struck them with great force, so that there fell slain of Israel 500,000 men, chosen men. The men of Israel were subdued at that time, and Judah prevailed because they relied on the Lord. That tells us something about Abijah compared to his father. He learned from his father's bad example what not to do. You get down here to the end of the chapter. Jeroboam did not recover his power in the days of Abijah. The Lord struck him down and he died. But Abijah grew mighty, and he took 14 wives and had 22 sons and 16 daughters. And the rest of the acts of Abijah, his ways and his sayings, are written in the story of the prophet of Iddo. And Abijah slept with his fathers. Now, he got a lot done in a short time. He was hardly a flawless man, but he did stand for the Lord. Things are going to turn around quick again in just a moment. Now, at this point, this is actually, we've got a couple of minutes left yet, but this is a good stopping point for us in our study. So I'm going to stop here, and then we'll pick up with Asa becoming king. And here's where the names are just going to come thick and fast. Stuff is, you want to talk about fruit basket turnover in Israel. Here it comes, because they're going to have as many kings in half as much time, basically, as Judah has over their whole history. It's just going to turn over and turn over and turn over and turn over, and it's blood and plunder and murder and treachery and backstabbing and violence all the way through, which is what you get when you turn away from the Lord. Maybe you heard about the young officer that was shot here in Atlanta today, trying to serve a warrant on a 22-year-old kid with a record as long as my leg, evidently. That young man has no fear of the Lord. Therefore, he has no fear of authority. Therefore, he thinks he can do as he pleases. And it's happening all over. Interesting tidbit, as I was driving up here tonight, they identified the officer who was shot. His name is David Rogers.
Oh my goodness, wow.
No relation as far as I know. But we'll stop there. Questions or thoughts or comments, anybody?
I finally got my the books of Kings of Judah and Israel.
Oh,
I really like, it's so practical. I love the way that Crockett laid it out.
it is. It's there are other and fewer books like that, but Crockett, which is way over 100 years old, is still, it's the most usable little harmony that I've ever run across. And so, no reason, I mean, as long as it's still available, there's no reason not to use it.
Yep. Thank you for class.
You're very welcome. And so's your bird. Ladies, I'll see y'all next week, good Lord willing.
Don't forget Rex. I'm here.
I'm glad to have you back. By the way, remember, if you're taking the class for credit, you need to get your research paper topic to me.
Yep.
And if you're not taking the class for credit, don't worry about it. We'll stop.
Got it. Have a good evening.
Lord willing, I will see y'all next week.
Take care, Dave.
Glad you made it,
Good
man.
night.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Y'all have a good evening.